The Defence White Paper of 1966 landed on the desk of Dennis Healey with the force of a guillotine. Command Paper 2901 cancelled CV-A01, the 50,000-ton fleet carrier that the Admiralty had spent the better part of a decade fighting for. With it died the Royal Navy's claim to genuine blue-water fixed-wing aviation. The Buccaneers and Phantoms would soldier on aboard Ark Royal until her paying off in 1978. But after that, the senior service was to surrender carrier strike entirely to the Royal Air Force. Healey's note to the Cabinet, Defence and Overseas Policy Committee on the 22nd of February made the position clear. There would be no replacement, and any future maritime air would come from shore-based RAF Phantoms operating from airfields in Cyprus, Gibraltar, and Singapore. The trouble was geography. The Falklands lay 8,000 miles from Plymouth Hoe, and no land-based aircraft could realistically defend a task force operating in the South Atlantic. This was a problem the naval staff identified almost immediately, and it produced a curious bureaucratic maneuver. Rather than fight for a conventional carrier, which Treasury would never sanction, the Admiralty proposed something called a through-deck cruiser. The phrase was deliberately bland. Sir Michael Pollock, then First Sea Lord, made certain the term carrier appeared nowhere in the staff requirement issued in 1969. The vessel that became HMS Invincible was sold to ministers as an anti-submarine platform, a helicopter ship for hunting Soviet boats in the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap. Whether the Sea King squadrons aboard could also be augmented by some form of fixed-wing aircraft was, officially, an afterthought. That afterthought was the Hawker P 1127, by then evolved into the Harrier GR Mark I in RAF service. Sir Sidney Cam's design team at Kingston had been working on jet-borne vertical lift since 1957, when the Bristol Engine Company first proposed the BE-53 vectored thrust power plant. The Treasury had nearly killed the program 3 times. In 1965, Roy Jenkins, as aviation minister, insisted the prototype Kestrels prove operationally viable before another penny was committed. The tripartite evaluation squadron at RAF West Raynham, formed with American and German pilots, salvaged the project by demonstrating dispersed operations from forest clearings in Lower Saxony. What made the naval variant possible was a single piece of correspondence from Vice Admiral Sir Raymond Ligo to the Controller of the Navy, dated the 17th of March, 1973. Ligo argued that a navalized Harrier, fitted with a basic search radar and Sidewinder rails, could provide point defense for a task force at less than 1/10 the unit cost of a Phantom. The Marconi Avionics Blue Fox radar, derived from the Sea Spray fitted to Lynx helicopters, was already in development. The estimated procurement cost per airframe was £4,200,000 at 1975 values. The Cabinet Office Defence Programme Working Party reviewed the proposal that October. The minutes, declassified at Q under file DEFE24/897, record Roy Mason's grudging assent. The aircraft would be ordered, but only 34 examples, and only if the through-deck cruisers were already in build. The contract for the Sea Harrier FRS Mark I was signed on the 15th of May, 1975. 24 were ordered initially. The first prototype, XZ438, flew from Dunsfold on the 20th of August, 1978, in the hands of John Farley. Nobody in the air staff at High Wycombe believed it would ever fight a real war. The Sea Harrier FRS Mark I was, By any reasonable engineering standard, a series of compromises stitched together with British pragmatism. The airframe began as a GR Mark III, the latest Royal Air Force ground attack variant, but the modifications demanded by maritime service were extensive enough that the Admiralty insisted on a separate type designation. The forward fuselage was lengthened by 11 inches to accommodate a raised cockpit, giving the pilot the all-round visibility essential for carrier recovery in poor weather. The original Smiths Industries head-up display from the GR Mark III was retained, but the navigation and attack system was rebuilt around the Ferranti Blue Fox in the redesigned nose. Blue Fox itself deserves particular attention because it was simultaneously the aircraft's most important sensor and its greatest single weakness. The radar was a derivative of the Sea Spray helicopter set, modified for air-to-air search. It operated in I-band at frequencies between 8 and 10 gigahertz with a peak power output of around 100 kilowatts. In lookup mode against a fighter-sized target, detection range was approximately 20 nautical miles. In lookdown mode, where the radar had to discriminate a contact against ground or sea clutter, the figures collapsed dramatically. There was no genuine pulse Doppler capability. Wing Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward, who commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron during the Falklands, recorded in his memoir that Blue Fox could barely see a mirage at 15 miles in a clear sky and nothing at all over land. The decision to fit it was driven by cost and weight, not capability. The power plant was the Rolls-Royce Pegasus Mark 104, a development of the engine that had powered the GR Mark III. It produced 21,500 pounds of thrust at sea level. The 4 rotating nozzles, 2 forward of the wing root and 2 aft, could be vectored from 0 to 98 degrees. The additional 8 degrees beyond vertical being the basis for what would later be called vectoring in forward flight. To withstand salt corrosion, the engine's magnesium components were replaced with aluminium alloys, and the airframe received extensive sealing of electrical connections. Even so, Fleet Air Arm engineers at Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton found themselves in a constant battle against the Atlantic. Replacement intervals for the Pegasus were considerably shorter than in RAF service. The armament fit reflected the same philosophy of minimum viable capability. 2 30mm Aden Mark IV cannon were carried in detachable pods beneath the fuselage, each with 130 rounds. The 4 wing pylons could carry a mix of 1,000-pound bombs, BL, 755 cluster munitions, or the AIM-9G Sidewinder. The G model Sidewinder was a rear aspect-only weapon, requiring the launching aircraft to maneuver into the target's exhaust cone, which in a high-energy fight against Mirages or Skyhawks would be very nearly impossible. The decision to upgrade to the all-aspect AIM-9L was not formalized until late 1981, after considerable American pressure through the Carter and Reagan administrations. Trials at the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down ran from 1979 into early 1981. The Boscombe Report, A and A.E.E. reference 1473 of February 1981, concluded that the aircraft was fit for service, though it noted concerns about the radar performance and the pilot workload during single-seat intercept operations. The first operational squadron, 800 Naval Air Squadron, was commissioned at Yeovilton on the 31st of March, 1980. Operational doctrine was, at that point, almost entirely theoretical. The fundamental difficulty with operating a fixed-wing aircraft from a small ship was not landing. vertical recovery had been demonstrated repeatedly by the RAF and the United States Marine Corps. The difficulty was launching with a useful warload. A Sea Harrier taking off vertically from a flat deck could carry perhaps 2 sidewinders and a half fuel state. A short, rolling takeoff from a flat flight deck improved matters considerably, but the aircraft still struggled to lift a full weapons load and the internal fuel needed for any meaningful combat air patrol radius. Without a catapult, and with no realistic prospect of one being fitted to the through-deck cruisers, the Royal Navy had a strike fighter that could not strike very far. The solution came from an unlikely source, a doctoral student at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Bedford. Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor of the Royal Navy, working on a higher degree at the Cranfield Institute of Technology, submitted his thesis in 1973. The proposition was disarmingly simple. If the forward portion of the deck were curved upwards at a modest angle, the aircraft would leave the ramp on a ballistic trajectory rather than a horizontal one. This gave the wings additional time to generate lift, and the engine additional time to be vectored downward before the aircraft had to support its own weight. Taylor's calculations, refined through wind tunnel work at RAE Bedford between 1973 and 1976, suggested that a 12-degree ramp would permit a Sea Harrier to launch with an additional 2,000 pounds of payload, or alternatively, the same payload from a deck run shortened by 300 feet. The Ministry of Defence procurement executive was sceptical. The first practical trials were conducted at RAE Bedford using a modified hunting engineering ramp, with John Farley flying XV 758, a development Harrier, on the 5th of August 1977. The results exceeded Taylor's predictions. By 1979, the ramp angle had been refined through further trials, and the Admiralty Board approved fitting a 7-degree structure to HMS Invincible and a 12-degree structure to HMS Hermes. The latter was more pronounced because Hermes, an older Centaur-class ship converted to commando carrier and then to anti-submarine duties, had a longer flight deck and could accommodate the larger angle without compromising helicopter operations forward. The structural engineering was undertaken by Marine Industries Limited at Birkenhead, working from drawings produced at Bath. The ramp on Hermes weighed approximately 120 tons and was fitted during her refit at Portsmouth in 1980. Invincible, then completing her construction at Vickers on the Tyne, received her ramp during build. The cost per ship was approximately £3 million at 1980 values, an almost trivial sum compared to the operational benefit. The Americans took notice. Senior officers from the United States Marine Corps, who operated the AV-8A from the Iwo Jima class amphibious ships, visited Yeovilton in late 1980 and again in early 1981. The subsequent fitting of ski jumps to American amphibious vessels, and later the Spanish Príncipe de Asturias and the Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi, all trace their lineage to Taylor's thesis. The doctrine that emerged was not merely about getting an aeroplane airborne. It was about the entire concept of small-deck air power, that a vessel of 20,000 tons displacement could project genuine fixed-wing capability, provided the aircraft, the deck, and the launch geometry were designed as an integrated system. Whether that doctrine would survive contact with the Fuerza Aérea Argentina remained, as of January 1982, a matter for theoreticians. The signal from the Commander-in-Chief Fleet at Northwood reached Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton at 2200 hours on the 2nd of April 1982. Argentine forces had landed at Mullet Creek some hours earlier, and Government House in Stanley had fallen by mid-morning. The standing orders for 800 and 899 Naval Air Squadrons were short and unambiguous. Prepare for embarkation aboard HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. Sailing date provisionally 5th of April. There were at that moment 20 operational Sea Harrier FRS Mark I's in the entire Fleet Air Arm. 8 were aboard Invincible, already at Portsmouth working up. 12 were at Yeovilton. 3 more were undergoing deeper maintenance at the British Aerospace Facility at Dunsfold and could not be made ready in time. The embarkation itself was a study in hurried improvisation. Hermes, due to pay off within 18 months, was undergoing a self-maintenance period at Portsmouth Dockyard. Boilers were partially stripped. The captain, Lynn Middleton, had men working through the night of the 3rd and 4th of April to reassemble the propulsion plant. The flight deck was loaded with stores, ammunition, and spares using portal cranes that had not been designed for the volume of traffic now demanded. 12 Sea Harriers from 800 Naval Air Squadron flew aboard on the morning of the 5th of April, the squadron commanded by Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld. 801 Naval Air Squadron, under Lieutenant Commander Sharkey Ward, embarked on Invincible with 8 aircraft. The task force sailed at 1100 hours, watched by an enormous crowd along the Round Tower at Old Portsmouth. 2 technical questions remained desperately unresolved during the passage south. The first concerned the AIM-9L Sidewinder. The all-aspect missile had been promised to the Royal Navy under a foreign military sales agreement signed in 1980. But the integration trials at the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment had not been completed. The clearance for operational carriage was still pending when the task force sailed. The matter was resolved through a direct intervention by Caspar Weinberger, the United States Secretary of Defense, who authorized the immediate transfer of 100 missiles from American stocks. The first batch was flown to Ascension Island aboard a C-141 Starlifter and transferred to the task force during the rendezvous on the 17th of April. The integration paperwork was, in the words of one Yeovilton armament officer interviewed by the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive in 1993, completed in pencil on the back of a signal pad. The second question concerned Blue Fox. The radar had performed adequately in North Sea trials, but had never been tested against the geographical conditions of the South Atlantic, where the boundary layer between sea and air produced ducting effects that could mask or exaggerate returns at unpredictable ranges. Ferranti engineers from Edinburgh sailed with the task force aboard the requisitioned cruise liner Canberra, working through software modifications that were transmitted to the squadrons by signal as the ships moved south. Reinforcements followed. 809 Naval Air Squadron was reformed at Yeovilton on the 8th of April under Lieutenant Commander Tim Gedge, drawing on instructors and aircraft taken from the Operational Training Unit. These 8 aircraft, painted in a hastily applied medium sea grey, sailed south aboard the requisitioned container ship Atlantic Conveyor on the 25th of April, transferring to the carriers off Ascension. By the time the task force entered the total exclusion zone on the 30th of April, 28 Sea Harriers were embarked. They were expected to face approximately 220 Argentine combat aircraft. The first offensive action of the air campaign began before dawn on the 1st of May. 12 Sea Harriers from 800 Naval Air Squadron, launched from Hermes at 0748 Zulu, conducted a low-level strike on the airfield at Stanley. The lead aircraft, flown by Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld, released a stick of 3 1,000-pound retarded bombs across the runway threshold. The strike was supported by a single Vulcan B Mark II of 44 Squadron, XM 607, which had departed Wide Awake Airfield at Ascension some 7 hours earlier in what would become known as Operation Black Buck 1. The bombing damage was modest. The runway remained operational for C-130 Hercules transports throughout the campaign. The strategic effect, however, was considerable. The junta in Buenos Aires now understood that the British task force was within striking range of the mainland, and Grupo Ocho's Mirage 3 EAs were redeployed northwards to defend Comodoro Rivadavia and the approaches to Buenos Aires itself. The first air-to-air engagement followed shortly after midday. Two Mirage 3 EAs of Grupo Ocho, call signs Dardo 1 and Dardo 2, were vectored by the Argentine air defense radar at Stanley toward a pair of Sea Harriers flying combat air patrol north of the islands. The Sea Harriers were XZ-451, flown by Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton of the Royal Air Force on exchange with 801 Naval Air Squadron and his wingman, Lieutenant Steve Thomas. Barton acquired the leading Mirage on Blue Fox at a range of approximately 15 miles, closing head-on at a combined velocity exceeding 1,200 knots. The Mirage pilots, Captain Garcia Cuerva and Lieutenant Perona, attempted a high yo-yo maneuver at 20,000 feet. Barton fired a single AIM-9L at Perona's aircraft from a rear quarter, the missile detonating against the tail section. Perona ejected. Thomas engaged Garcia Cuerva moments later. The Mirage was damaged and attempted a forced landing at Stanley, where it was destroyed by Argentine anti-aircraft fire, which mistook it for a British aircraft. A second engagement that afternoon involved Lieutenant Commander Mike Broadwater and Lieutenant Commander Alan Curtis of 801 Naval Air Squadron, who intercepted a flight of 3 Israeli-built daggers of Grupo 6 over Pebble Island. Curtis fired one AIM-9L, which destroyed Lieutenant Ardiles' aircraft outright. The kill was registered at 15:36 Zulu. Ardiles was the cousin of the Tottenham Hotspur footballer, a fact that received considerable attention in the British press during the days that followed. By dusk, on the 1st of May, the Fleet Air Arm had achieved 3 confirmed kills for no losses. The pattern of the air war was, in those first 8 hours, established. Argentine pilots were operating at the absolute extremity of their fuel range. A Mirage 3 EA departing Rio Gallegos had perhaps 5 minutes of combat fuel over the Falklands before turning for home. The Sea Harriers, by contrast, were operating from carriers stationed approximately 100 miles east of Stanley, with combat air patrol durations of 70 to 90 minutes routine. The intelligence picture was assembled at the task force's flagship operations room aboard Hermes, with supporting analysis from the Joint Intelligence Committee in Whitehall, and signals intercepts processed at Government Communications Headquarters in Cheltenham. The picture confirmed what Wing Commander Ward had argued at the pre-deployment briefing on the 5th of April. The Sea Harrier was not, on paper, a superior aircraft. In practice, geography and weapons technology had given the Royal Navy a decisive tactical advantage. The mythology of the Sea Harrier coalesced quickly in the British press during May and June of 1982, and one element of that mythology has proved remarkably durable. Vectoring in forward flight, abbreviated to VIFF, was the technique by which a Sea Harrier pilot could, in theory, rotate the engine nozzles downward during forward flight. This generated a sudden deceleration and a pitch-up moment that would, the legend held, leave a pursuing fighter to overshoot harmlessly into a Sidewinder envelope. The Daily Telegraph carried at least 3 illustrated articles describing the maneuver. The Royal Navy's own publicity branch was not entirely above promoting the story. The reality, established through subsequent debriefing of the Falklands aircrew at Royal Naval Air Station Ewelvilton during the autumn of 1982, was that VIFF was used in combat on no recorded occasion. The post-conflict analysis compiled by the Naval Air Warfare Center, document NAWC reference 147 of November 1982, found that no Sea Harrier pilot deployed VIFF against an Argentine fighter. The technique had been demonstrated at Boscombe Down and was occasionally practiced in air combat maneuvering training, but its tactical utility was marginal. Decelerating violently at low altitude over hostile water with two Arden cannon pods causing additional drag was not a survival-enhancing decision against a Mirage with a wingman. What actually defeated the Fuerza Aérea Argentina was a combination of three factors, none of which made for stirring newspaper copy. The first was the AIM-9L Sidewinder. The L model, designated AIM-9-Lima in American service, used an indium antimonide seeker head-cooled to 77 Kelvin by a high-pressure nitrogen bottle. This gave it sensitivity sufficient to track an aircraft from any aspect, including the cooler forward hemisphere where a fighter's exhaust plume was masked by its own airframe. The kill probability of the AIM-9L during the campaign was extraordinary. Of 26 missiles fired by Sea Harriers, 19 achieved confirmed kills. The figure of 73% compares to perhaps 15% for earlier Sidewinder variants in Vietnam. The second factor was fuel. Brigadier Ernesto Crespo, commanding the South Atlantic Theater Air Force from Comodoro Rivadavia, faced a problem that no amount of pilot skill could solve. The combat radius of a Mirage 3EA from Rio Gallegos to the Falklands was 420 nautical miles, leaving approximately 400 pounds of fuel for combat. The A4 Skyhawks of Grupo 5, flying from Rio Grande, had even less margin. The Argentine Air Force possessed two KC-130 tankers, both heavily committed. A British combat air patrol had, by comparison, perhaps 30 minutes of full afterburner reserves before recovery. Argentine pilots arrived over the islands fuel critical, often unable to engage in sustained maneuvering without ditching on the return leg. The third factor was tactical doctrine. The Sea Harrier squadrons employed a pairs and fours formation derived from the Royal Air Force's battle flight procedures at RAF Wattisham, modified for the maritime environment. Combat air patrols were stationed between 40 and 100 miles from the carriers, vectored by the Type 992Q air search radar aboard Hermes and Invincible, supplemented later by the Type 1022 aboard the Type 42 destroyers. The Argentine attackers, lacking integrated airborne early warning, were repeatedly intercepted before reaching their targets. The Sea Harrier won not because it outturned a Mirage. It won because it was in the right place, with the right missile, against an opponent operating on borrowed minutes. Air supremacy was never absolute. The euphoria that followed the engagements of the 1st of May concealed a more difficult truth. The Argentine Air Force, despite operating at the edge of its endurance, retained the capacity to inflict severe damage on the British task force whenever the weather, the geography, or simple chance worked in its favour. The Sea Harrier could not be everywhere at once. 28 aircraft, stretched between two carriers and a continuous combat air patrol commitment, could maintain perhaps 4 aircraft airborne at any given moment. The gaps in coverage, particularly during the dawn and dusk transitions when carrier launch cycles were most vulnerable, were exploited repeatedly. The first Sea Harrier loss occurred on the 4th of May. Lieutenant Nick Taylor, of 800 Naval Air Squadron, flying XZ-450, was killed during a low-level attack on Goose Green airfield. The aircraft was struck by 35mm Oerlikon fire from an Argentine GDF-002 anti-aircraft battery emplaced in dug-in positions to the north of the runway. Taylor's aircraft impacted the ground at high speed. The wreckage was buried by Argentine forces and later recovered after the surrender for repatriation to the United Kingdom. He was the first Royal Naval aircrew killed in action since the Korean War. The loss prompted an immediate review of low-level attack profiles. Subsequent strikes against well-defended targets were transferred where possible to the Royal Air Force Harrier GR. Mark IIIs of one squadron, which had embarked on Atlantic conveyor on the 25th of April and would, after the loss of that ship on the 25th of May, operate from Hermes for the remainder of the campaign. The pivotal disaster of the campaign occurred on the 8th of June at Bluff Cove. The Royal Fleet Auxiliary landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, lying at anchor in Port Pleasant Inlet, were attacked by 5 Skyhawk A4s of Group 05. The Sea Harrier Combat Air Patrol assigned to the area had been redirected northwards approximately 40 minutes earlier in response to a separate raid warning that proved spurious. 3,000-pound bombs struck Sir Galahad. 56 men were killed, the majority Welsh Guardsmen of the 1st Battalion, with serious burns inflicted on a further 150. Lance Corporal Simon Weston, who survived burns to 46% of his body, would become one of the most recognised faces of the conflict in subsequent decades. The Bluff Cove attack illustrated the limits of what 28 aircraft could achieve. The Board of Inquiry convened at Northwood under Rear Admiral Sir Anthony Whetstone. Its findings reported in October 1982 and partially declassified in 2005, identified the absence of airborne early warning as the single most serious capability gap. The Royal Navy had, in 1966, abandoned the Fairey Gannet AEW Mark III when Ark Royal paid off. Without it, the task force depended entirely on shipborne radar, with a horizon limited by the curvature of the Earth to approximately 25 nautical miles against a low-flying target. Sea-skimming Skyhawks were detected at ranges that gave Sea Harriers insufficient time to intercept. By the Argentine surrender on the 14th of June, the Fleet Air Arm had lost 6 Sea Harriers. 2 were destroyed by ground fire, including Taylor's aircraft. 4 were lost in operational accidents, including a mid-air collision between Lieutenant Commander Gordon Batt and Lieutenant Commander John Ayton Jones on the 6th of May in conditions of extremely poor visibility. None had been lost in air-to-air combat. The Falklands had answered the question of whether the Sea Harrier could fight a real war. It had not answered the question of what came next. The aircraft that returned to Yeovilton in late July 1982 was, in technical terms, the same machine that had sailed in April. Blue Fox remained inadequate against low-level targets. The aircraft still possessed no beyond visual range missile capability. The combat radius, even with the ski jump, was modest. The Naval Staff Requirement 6422, drafted at Whitehall in 1983, called for what the Treasury would describe as a midlife update. What emerged after a protracted procurement process was the Sea Harrier FA Mark II, fitted with a Ferranti Blue Vixen pulse Doppler radar and integrated with the Hughes AIM-120 AMRAAM. Blue Vixen, a genuine multimode radar developed at Edinburgh, gave the aircraft true look-down, shoot-down capability for the first time. The first FA Mark II flew on the 19th of September, 1988. The type entered operational service in 1993 with 899 Naval Air Squadron at Yeovilton. The aircraft saw action again over the Adriatic during Operation Deny Flight, the United Nations no-fly zone enforcement over Bosnia-Herzegovina. 801 Naval Air Squadron deployed aboard HMS Ark Royal, the third ship to bear the name, in 1993. On the 16th of April 1994, Lieutenant Nick Richardson was shot down by a man-portable surface-to-air missile, almost certainly a Strela 2M, while supporting French troops near Gorazde. He ejected and was recovered after 16 hours on the ground. Subsequent operations during the NATO air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999 saw Sea Harrier FA Mark IIs operating from HMS Invincible in the Ionian Sea, conducting combat air patrol over the Adriatic and limited air-to-ground sorties against Serbian armour in Kosovo. The retirement, when it came, was politically driven rather than operationally justified. The Strategic Defence Review of 1998 had created the Joint Force Harrier concept, integrating Royal Air Force GR Mark 7s with Royal Navy FA. Mark IIs under a single command structure based at Royal Air Force Cottesmore. The arrangement worked, by most assessments, reasonably well. The Treasury-driven Defence White Paper of July 2004, however, identified the Sea Harrier fleet as a candidate for early retirement. The argument advanced by the Ministry of Defence was that the Pegasus Mark 104 engine performed poorly in hot, high environments such as the Persian Gulf, and that an upgrade to the Pegasus Mark 107 was not cost-effective given the imminent introduction of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. The last Sea Harrier sortie was flown by Lieutenant Commander Chris Gotka from Yeovilton on the 28th of March 2006. The Royal Navy would be without organic fixed-wing fast jet capability for the next 13 years until the Lightning Force began carrier qualification aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2019. The judgment of history has been broadly kind. The Sea Harrier was a compromised aircraft, designed under Treasury constraint, fitted with a radar that its own operational commander described as inadequate, and procured in numbers that left no margin for attrition. It was, nonetheless, the platform that demonstrated what small-deck air power could achieve. The doctrine pioneered by Doug Taylor's ramp at Bedford propagated to American, Spanish, Italian, Indian, and Thai navies. 20 Sea Harriers in 8 weeks of combat had defended a task force 8,000 miles from home, against odds nobody at Whitehall in 1975 had seriously expected them to face.